Welcome to another episode of Surgeons' Lives. I'm your host, John Monson. Today's guest, I'm delighted to say, is something of a superstar in the world of surgery and certainly a trailblazer. I've tried to do this introduction a few times, but it's hard to condense all she has achieved in her career in such a few words. Julie Freischlag is currently, and let me get this right, the Chief Executive Officer of Atrium Health Wake Forest Baptist, the Chief Academic Officer and Executive Vice President of Advocate Health, and the Executive Vice President for Health Affairs at Wake Forest University, and Dean of the Wake Forest School of Medicine. So just saying that is tiring enough. She's been a remarkable trailblazer in surgery, first of all, as a vascular surgeon par excellence, specializing in complex work and particularly thoracic outlet syndrome. She undertook fellowships on the West Coast and was on faculty in San Diego, and then perhaps really hit the headlines when she became chair of surgery in Johns Hopkins. She was there for 11 years before going back west again to UC Davis, and then in 2017 moved to Wake Forest. She tells a really interesting story about the experience of a female training in surgery and in vascular surgery, and what she sees as her vision and in her leadership position, supporting all forms of diversity, inclusion, in everything that means, not just gender, but people of color, etc., etc. She has a few interesting observations, to say the least, on what it's like being a surgeon over the last number of years in a career that has resulted in honors and awards galore, most recently perhaps being 2021 the president of the American College of Surgeons. So enough from me. Let's go over and talk to Julie Freischlag. I'm John Monson, and this is Surgeons' Lives. So thanks so much for joining and willing to have a chat for a few minutes. This is a very low-key thing I have started, really, which is called Surgeons' Lives, and but the strapline is, stuff that matters, which isn't necessarily the operation or what everybody thinks is the traditional model. So I'm just trying to, show that surgeons are a multicolored entity, really, just rather than their CV. But we normally do start with a little review of career and life to date, because it sets the scene. And if you're happy to, what I normally ask people is to just give us a brief life journey, starting with the words "I was born in," which, by the way, does not mean your age; it means the location.
Yeah, oh, good. Yeah, that's great. So I was born in a small town in the Midwest, Decatur, Illinois. Soybean capital of the world, made high flyer kites, which you probably don't know what those are, but they were those yellow kites. And my dad was a circulation manager, a small newspaper there. Huh. He moved a lot. He moved to Carbondale, Illinois when I was like 2, and then we moved back to Urbana when I was 7, and then moved up to Chicago, where he became the circulation manager of the Chicago Tribune when I was in high school. So I went to 3 grade schools and 3 high schools. So I moved a lot, and I skipped first grade. So when my older brother was a year ahead of me, and I read all his books, and I talk a lot, so I was a discipline problem. So I skipped first grade and went off to college at the University of Illinois when I was 17. I was going to be a teacher, but they closed education. My mom was a teacher. She taught elementary school. So I love science, and so I to be a nurse, you had to leave college and go up to Chicago a year early, and I was having way too much fun. So I stayed and applied to medical school and got an early decision actually at Rush Medical College. I thought I was going to be a pediatrician, and I did surgery first to get it out of the way, and love surgery, and because there's no medical people in my family. So then I did rotations as a student and decided I wanted to go to California. There was a woman resident just finishing at UCLA. There were very few women in those years because I finished medical school in 1980, and I was one of 3 women in my class at UCLA, and I was the only one that finished from that group. I was the 6th woman to finish at UCLA, and ended up going to vascular. Then there weren't fellowships. You just said you wanted it, and they gave me the job. And I also negotiated my way out of one of my years of general surgery too. So after 7 years, I was vascular and research done and general surgery done. So my first job was in San Diego. I went there because my first husband had a fellowship, and then moved back to LA, then got divorced and moved to Milwaukee. And that's where I spent 6 years with John Town. I ran the VA surgery, and then I just vascular, and then I ran the whole thing. And then I went back to UCLA to run the division that trained me. So I was the division chief at UCLA from 98 to 2003. And then I went to Hopkins in 2003 to be chair. I started looking at chair jobs and was there for 11 years. And then I went out to UC Davis to be the dean and vice chancellor. And they ended up firing my chancellor and having a little political strife because our president was Janet Napolitano, and decided that if they fired the person that hired me, that maybe I should look for another job. So I did. So I came to Wake 6 years ago. I was CEO, and then the dean left. I was dean. I just hired a dean. So I'm actually CEO of Medical Center. I'm also chief academic officer of Advocate Health because we sort of combine with a large health system. And I'm still a vice president of health affairs for the Wake Forest University. So I spend my time mainly in the academic arena, coordinating that, as well as running our $5 billion group here in the Medical Center.
Well, I got to tell you, I'm just exhausted listening to that.
I'm tired too.
I mean, that is some ranging somewhere between amazing and ridiculous. Yeah. So a couple of things. You went so fast I didn't have a chance to write them down. You graduated a year after I graduated from medical school, and yeah, I was intrigued by 3 women in your year. 2 of whom didn't finish. In my year in medical school, there were a bunch of women in our year, including my lovely wife. But
my med school class was 42% women, but that was unusual here. That was because of our dean, Norma Wagner.
Right.
At that time, it was about 10% women in the States.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll come back to it in due course. The question as to, how you've seen life for women in medicine and surgery change over the years. But you certainly, at least on paper, suffered from a bit of wanderlust, as in you moved around, and which is sometimes the nature of it's the nature of surgery. Sometimes it's the nature of successful academics, and you got to go to where the opportunities are. Do you think I had a good friend in England who was a partner of mine when I was chairman there, and his dad worked for Woolworths, actually. And so he was constantly moving around. And when Peter grew up, he decided he didn't want to do that. He wasn't going to move anywhere. And he never did. He never moved at all. And it was an elective decision. You moved around a little bit as a kid, which obviously didn't put you off moving around a bit as needed. Yeah.
Yeah. And part of it was all opportunity, right? To do it.
Sure.
I went to the West Coast, I think, when I look back, they had just finished a woman resident there in 1980. So I saw that. And so I think actually that was one of the reasons I went out there to do it. Plus, I got snowed into a hospital for a few days in Chicago, decided I wanted better weather. I was young too. I started my internship at 25 and I was done training at 32. And so I think part of that too is, I was young. I felt that I could do most anything. And then there was a divorce in there, trying to figure out how to make it work. And then I met my husband when I was in Milwaukee, actually through a dating service, if you can believe it. Now we've been married 30 years and we've moved quite a bit. He actually never thought he'd move. But I guess part of it, I think the dimension of seeing different healthcare systems have been good. I also am a pretty big extrovert, so I like people.
It's a pretty good investment in the fee for the dating service.
Yeah, back then it was pretty cheap. You did a video and you had to go in every day. You couldn't do it online. It was the 90s.
Oh, it was like the actual old-fashioned blind date. So, if I was to, if I could pluck out of the ether, somebody who was there at the time, do you think they would have marked you out as someone to watch, and when, or was that evident from day one? What do you think, looking back?
Well, I think in medical school, my best friend, he went into otolaryngology, and actually I'm giving the medical school graduation talk at Milwaukee next week, and he's there, and he'll tell you that I was pretty outspoken. I think part of it, since I had skipped a grade and I'm not very tall, and somehow I'm quite opinionated, and so I think part of it is that I always would raise my hand to drive change, and I don't know where that came from. I used to think it was from my dad because he was sort of a force, but I think it was more my mom, because she was an educator, and she said, get your education, be the smartest person in the room, and then you can do anything you want. And even my grandfather, when I skipped to first grade, he was a coal miner, and he basically said, they're going to tell you can't do stuff, and you're going to tell them you can, because that was the nature of things. I think probably even back in high school, to do it, I was pretty socially active too. I was on homecoming court, I did all that, but then I also had great grades, and I never ever felt that was something you couldn't do both with. I think also my ability to work with groups of people, I think, has always been there. So, as you go forward and lead and do things these days, being able to get along with teams is a huge thing to do. And I had two brothers, an older one and a younger one. So I think partly was you just were able to do whatever you wanted to do with, as long as you move fast and you had a good reason.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that you were the one that would put your hand up. You had a vivid personality, or you wanted to change things, and outspoken, all of those words, etc. I was listening to a guy yesterday in a totally different field, and who's a retired racing driver, but he's been very successful ever since in running various things. And he made a comment that you don't need to be the loudest voice in the room to succeed. And somebody had said to him once, if you speak quietly and softly, it makes other people shut up to listen to you, because they have to listen. They can't hear what you're saying. And that's not me, and it's clearly not you. Yeah. But it's an interesting comment. And, I'm sure, you and I have both seen people over the years who fit that model. They sit quietly, they say nothing, everybody's wondering what they're thinking. And, an old mentor of mine said to me, if you say nothing, everyone thinks you're a genius, because
or if you open your mouth and you prove them wrong, right, to do it.
Exactly. But, the successful people, assimilate all the information for the last 50 minutes and then come up with the summary that everyone has worked out, but it's the only thing you said, so they think you're a genius, etc.
Well, I do listen really well, and I remember everything. I have
mm,
an incredible, I remember when you said it, how you said it, where we bought stuff, all that kind of stuff. And I have a photographic memory. It's not as vivid as when I was younger. So I actually can remember where I read things and where I was to do it. So I do
wow.
think I've learned to listen a lot more. As surgeons are pretty outspoken as you run your ORs and make decisions. But in my new roles, you really have to listen to others that have expertise, such as
Yeah.
human resources and lawyers and people that you don't know that thing to. And then setting up a team that actually tells you stuff. I think with some of this new partnership, we're seeing leaders that people still fear a little bit, or they don't want to challenge. And I think the best thing about academic medicine is we're constantly challenging what we do, how we do it, where we do it. Students, we allow them to speak up and talk to us. I think that as a leader, making sure people know they can say stuff is really important.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the great things of your career and my career is that you meet the full spectrum of people. The way they manage things, and yet are equally successful. One of my oldest friends in surgery, from the 1980s, when I first met him, when he was a BJS traveling fellow,
Yes,
was one Courtney Townsend.
I know that guy.
And I say to Courtney all the time, how on earth did you succeed politically? Because he's from Paris, Texas, through and through,
Yeah,
and I think it's because what you see is authentic.
yes.
It's
He is an example of someone who doesn't say much till the end. He was secretary of the board of the American College of Surgeons, and the number of times he spoke, I can sort of count on one hand. But when he did, it was pretty vibrant, and his silence sometimes was very powerful as well too. Plus, he hung out with his boss, who was quite noisy. So also I think it depends on who you partner with.
yeah,
If you someone that
yeah. No,
has,
that's
yeah.
for sure. When you look back, did you have people who you would identify now, or even then and now, as specific mentors? And if so, how did you get them?
Yeah, I'm not even sure I knew the word mentor,
Mm-hmm.
back when we started. I did surgery, and the chief resident, or the senior resident, then my chief resident, was a guy named Tom Witt, and he ended up being a breast surgeon in Chicago. And that's when you had 50 or 60 patients in the hospital, and you would do flip rounds. You'd be on cards figuring out who was in hospital and as a student or an intern, and you go flying around to find them. And he just was amazing. And that's when we also ran 3 or 4 rooms. He was a good clinician, and he was so kind. I think that there was the piece that he was so kind. And also Steve Economo was
Mm-hmm.
a surgeon there with us, and I ended up training with his son. And I think they saw the possibility, because I don't think, and our intern, we had a woman intern, Roseanne Krinsky, who was very small, smaller than me, and her husband was a medicine resident. And so that was interesting, and that was per chance, right, to see it. But at UCLA, it was really Ron Busatil. I was in his research lab. He actually, we just had a fest trip for him, and he said I was the best resident he ever trained, but he never told me. He goes, back then they never did. You
No,
just
no.
and I gave a lot of rabbits appendicitis and studied neutrophils and did the cases. And Westmore too was very helpful, making sure that I got trained well. They didn't really talk a lot about leadership or running teams or that. It was mainly making sure you were excellent clinically to go forward.
Yeah.
So they were probably the best ones. And then as I went through to be a chair of surgery, the dean at Hopkins, Ed Miller, was just amazing. He wanted to change surgery. I was the only woman chair there for 11 years. It was 2003. It was a crazy time. And he really backed me. sometimes he would tell me I was doing it wrong. He was a great big man, 6'6", so he would sometimes thunder his opinion with me, but overall mainly let me do it my way, and understood that I was driven to do the right thing no matter what. So it was mainly men. There weren't any women around. There were a
No.
few surgeons around that I admired, Patty Newman and Olga Jonathan, but they were not my day-to-day people. I
Yeah.
spend a lot of time now talking to a lot of women surgeons around the country as they negotiate jobs or figure out what they want to do. But back then, that wasn't done. You just sort of figured it out your way.
Yeah, and I've said to several people that I've interviewed, and they've said to me that this conversation that we're having today would never have happened 25 years ago, because with this type of sort of touchy-feely conversation was considered to be a sign of weakness, and that sort of stuff, and you should be working until you fell over, and that sort of thing. So
Well,
as
every other night when I trained, I
yeah,
mean,
for sure, yeah,
it's a different thing, and there wasn't much backup. We thought we did it the right way. I mean, it was just a different time, and they really
right.
were making you resilient. And most people turned out okay, but a handful did not.
Yeah, it's a stress system. It exposes, and this is not meant to be pejorative in any way, but I've sadly and tragically seen a number of suicides over the years, and the easy thing is to blame the job, if you like, and the residency or whatever it might be. And of course it's not really. It's somebody who has a mental health issue, who finds themselves in a circumstance that is stressful and not nurturing. And in that sense it's the job, but it's not that the job made you kill yourself. I mean, there's
In the wrong spot, the wrong time.
yeah. So now that you mention it, as I said to you when we bumped into each other at the college at the Dublin at the Irish reception, Julie Freischlag became known outside of vascular surgery to the wider world when you took that job, and everyone remembers where they were when they heard.
Yes.
And so you were 11 years there. You did something that everybody tells you not to do, which is to follow the legend. You're meant to be the person who follows the person who follows the legend. Summarize that experience for me. I mean, it was, now you're distant from it. It was 11 years, so it obviously wasn't a one and done, if you like. I mean, there was a decade of your life and more.
Yeah. Well, I didn't really know John Cameron. I had actually interviewed there for the vascular position a few years ahead, but I already had a vascular position, and I actually had told the business manager, I had told John that I really wasn't going to. You always look at the Hopkins job because it's a great job, but I said I'm not moving until I'm chair to make that happen. John Cameron, really wanted to orchestrate the whole succession planning like most everybody does, and
Sure.
Keith Lillimore is a really great guy. But the whole search committee, everybody wanted a change in surgery. And years later, Keith actually talked about it when he gave a presidential address saying, this is what should happen. Part of it is his daughter's a surgeon. So I think he actually watched it through her eyes for a bit. So the first few years were really hard because, he was there, he was still operating. He wasn't real happy. Keith left within the first year to go be chair at Indiana. But I was able, it was 2003 to 2008. So before the financial collapse, we had a lot of money. I hired 100 surgeons. We were able to increase our research. So the culture change really slowly but surely, we started doing some strategic planning. And you're looking at goal setting, all kinds of interesting things to make it work. And partly, I just listened. That my first day, I just had interns come in and talk to me and look at who they wanted to be. And every Monday, I would meet with either interns 2s or freezer 4s at 6:30 and just listen to them. And I did that for 11 years. What's going on? Where are you going? And I initially operated and took call for the first 5 years or so, and then I really focused on thoracic outlet. But I was in the OR every week and really reorganized how we focused our attention, how we taught and trained, and just did it pretty methodical. Part of it was just getting everybody's trust, that you weren't there to condemn when they came to look at the residency program. I said, we don't have to tell them what's wrong, but we have to tell them what we're going to do that's right. And actually, I had a couple helping things. I showed up, it was the 80-hour work week, it was timeouts in the OR, and then also it was all about RVUs, which nobody had heard. So they all thought it was my idea and not the system. And so interesting, we actually got cited in medicine for a resident working too many hours. So they came to the institution. So we really had to forcefully start the 80 hours, which I'm not sure we would have done without that citation to do that.
Sure.
Time we had, a calamity. I mean, we had 2 or 3 major crazy events, just making sure you were transparent about them and talked about them and got a lot of input was really important. And then to get friendships with all the other chairs as well. I also had a 7-year-old when I moved there, so I was raising a 7-year-old. And so he ended up, he did all his schooling in Baltimore. And that's the longest I've ever lived anywhere, is there 11 years. And he went through school and my husband at that time stopped working to be home with him. So I was trying to raise a kid also. And so I think that actually people watched me raising my son as well as running that. And I think that actually made me real. And so they realized that, I was balancing, and we did a lot. I actually got $1 million for cultural change. That was part of my deal. And it was mainly for parties. They still have a holiday party at the aquarium every year, and I gave out cash prizes to the residents. We had a raffle. The first one we had, I had everybody vote for core values, and we had garbage cans that said excellence and trust, and so everybody got to vote. If you voted, you got to be in the raffle to win money. So of course everybody voted to make that happen, and that's how we got our core values. So everybody looked forward to that party. We had some picnics. They had football games and softball games that we continued to do. But the holiday party was probably the biggest thing that made it happen.
So now I have to ask you, sitting in the chair that you're sitting in at the moment, would the request for $1 million for parties be viewed upon kindly by Dr. Freischlag?
Well, we didn't call it parties. We called it cultural change. Yeah, we called it cultural change.
Yeah.
It was totally flexible budget is what we would call it.
Yes, well,
strategic planning. Nowadays, I would put it under strategic planning is what I would do, which is exactly what we did over time.
Yeah. Well, you better hope that the folks in your organization don't hear this bit of the talk, because they'll be knocking on your door for the the party money.
Especially these days, to do it.
So I said we'd discuss the changing culture in terms of what now, again, the other thing that was never mentioned, nobody knew the term was diversity and inclusion at the beginning, but now that's what we call it. And you can throw in on top of that things such as Me Too movement and one thing or another. It goes without saying that the world is surgical world, the medical world, and probably the world is a little more accommodating for women in the workplace than was the case 20, 30 years ago. But specifically in surgery, how far do you think we are down that journey? Are we in the first 3 steps, or are we 80%? What do you think?
Well, it was interesting. When I went to Hopkins, the whole system didn't have a maternity policy. I think they just got one a few years ago. So there was no maternity policy. When I was at UC Davis, it was, 12 weeks, to do it. So it depends on what system you're in. And we actually installed our own 6-week maternity policy for everybody, residents and faculty, and 2 weeks for guys or partners. And it was funny that the guys would go home and come back within a day or two because they didn't want to be home. Mother-in-laws were there and that. So they took it later to make it happen. And here we actually did a policy too, whether you adopt or whether you are same sex. And actually the people that hurt the most, I think, actually are the staff. They don't have the resources and they have the same lack of policy too. And also, lactation rooms and things which didn't exist. Now, I was an in vitro mom. I'd written about it. So I went through in vitro and actually the third time I actually told my partner so I could go home, because the first time I had to do a ruptured aneurysm the day I had my eggs implanted. So that didn't work out so well. So my group actually really feel that they were responsible for my son to be born. And then I took about 11 weeks off because I was older and had a little bit of heart complications and things like that. So I sort of lived and breathed it and had great daycare across the street. So, and my husband worked till he was 3, then we moved to LA and he worked less. But, somebody needs to be around to help, whether it's hired or not. I think everybody's got a different flavor of what they think they need help with. And now I think we have partners, that both are real busy. There's so many dual couples now because there's so many women in med school. And so that I think is the last frontier, is where they're both busy. I've got quite a few very busy couples here that are, and then they have 4 kids, trying to make it. And then what if somebody needs some special attention? I think that's hard. So I think if you look at the number of women going into surgery, especially general surgery, and then this new vascular 0.5, it's markedly increased. If you look at the number to 50%, and actually the 0.5 vascular is at least half women. And then we see women leaders, which help. I was the only woman vascular division chief at UCLA in the whole country during that time. I was only the 4th woman chair, and now we have about 30 women chairs, still not that many women deans. I just hired a woman dean because I've got too much on my plate. And so, but there's still only about 30 women deans, but now there's more women vascular division chiefs, but the guys won't give it up. I mean, they love their job, and probably the answer to this is really term limits. Mayo Clinic does that, Canada does it. Many European countries do it, 2 5-year terms. And frankly, after 11 years at Hopkins, everything, then you have to redo everything again. So it's probably time to go do something else.
And just on the term limit thing, I was a chair for 15 years and in a pretty large department, and I'm pretty sure I was not on the top of my game for all 15 years. I think maybe 12. I was good. And number one, so that's number one. And number two, I'm a big fan of, give someone else a chance.
Oh, absolutely. And there's always something to do, just like people don't like to resign off of editorial board. I'm on the JAMA oversight committee. That's where I was the last 2 days looking at the JAMA journals, because I was an editor for 10 years. There's always something to do. So I think we've done really well. The thing I think I've found that when I want to make a decision, if I put everybody in the room that looks just like me, we make a really bad decision.
Yeah.
So what you want is whatever you look like, make sure your team looks different. And right now, the biggest thing I'm focusing on is youth. If you put a bunch of old people in a room, we come up with what it used to be. You need to put younger people on your teams, and also certainly women and people of color, and also in surgery, people that train different. When I first went to Hopkins, probably the first time we did recruiting, because I just had signed, but I wasn't quite there yet. So we were doing recruiting in January, February, because I took a couple months off to move my family there. And it was charts, we had piles of charts. And we only looked at people from like 5 schools, from Mass General, from Emory, from Vanderbilt. And I was like, do you think there's anybody good from Kansas or from University of California? No, And so the biggest diversity I did initially was, let's look at kids maybe from the West Coast, or look at kids that we from Kansas, or other places, and diversity, or from Resch, where I was, to do it. So the diversity initially came from there, and then we had a bunch of preliminary residents, and they were mainly kids that hadn't matched, mainly because they had a personality problem, like either plastics, and that personality problem didn't go away. So we started taking international graduates who were amazing, but not from a U.S. med school. So they would come in as prelims, and it helped our diversity. They were terribly motivated. And most times, if they were good, we had people quit, surgery residents quit one every other year or so. So many of them, one of the head pancreatic surgeons now at Hopkins is Jin He, who was fully trained in China and came to us, and he's incredible to do it. And I have a Jonathan Batts, a vascular surgeon in Missouri now, and he actually came to us also. He wrote an article about it. I only had one suitcase. She interviewed me, gave me my job, and he had come to us from Singapore, to do it.
Yeah.
Now he's an amazing surgeon. So I think adding those few things really made us so much better. And I just basically said, let's look at a couple other schools, to do it. Let's and we did focus on integrating more women at the beginning, but then the women started being cut up to the top by criteria without having to mention it.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing still is people of color. I think that's still hard. I have a college kid that trails me every year here from Wake Forest, and this year it's a young African American man, and he wants to be a plastic surgeon. And the first one I did just matched at UCSF in surgery. He wants to be a heart surgeon, but when he started work with me in 2017, he had no idea what he wanted to do. His family had nothing, and he ended up at Case. And now he's going to be a surgeon. It's one person at a time, And I think that's the attention I got from Steve Economo, and when I was training in Ron Busatil. I think we've done pretty well. But the thing about surgeons that's so funny is, on Friday afternoon, which is today, when all hell breaks loose this afternoon, and there's 14 cases to do, and everybody gets a field promotion. If you're around, you're going to get to do anything you want, because we don't care what you look like. I mean, are you breathing? Can you push the bed? Can you close that wound? Whatever you got, I need your help. So I actually think we allow people to rise to the occasion just because of the nature of our business versus looking at your CV or making sure I know what year you are, to do it. So I do think we're inclusive under duress, and then we actually realize we can be inclusive during calm as well.
Yeah, and it takes some places never had cultural exclusivity, and I remember a good colleague of mine in England who became a chair of surgery, but he was from the north of England, and the north in England, as you know, is very divided between the north and south, and he was from Newcastle, and he will tell you that he has no idea how, but he got an interview for medical school in Barts in St. Bartholomew's, and the first two interviewers grilled him as to which member of his family had been in Barts, and he said, "Well, no." What about your mother? Is she in Barts? And then the guy said to him, "Well, who's been in Barts?" And he said, "Nobody." So he said, the guy said to him, "So what does your father do exactly?" And he said, he's a painter. And he said, "Oh, really?" He said, "Is he portrait or landscape in style?" And he said, "No, he's battleships." He says he works in the shipyards. And he said, he's certain his rejection letter was on the same train as he was on back to Newcastle. That sort of stuff went on for years. And when I was in Imperial in London, we always took a nice young boy from the Welsh Valleys who was good at playing rugby because of the Hospitals Cup. There was London had this enormous tournament for medical schools playing rugby, and so St. Mary's had a link with the Welsh Valleys. It was the mining. All the patients used to come from Wales, and we always took a rugby. It didn't matter whether the guy was thick as two planks, you know. If he was good at rugby, you know, he was a shoe-in. So, so now the flip side of that, of course, is we have you know, now we have, you know, the concept of manels, you know, and I guess that's inevitable, isn't it? I mean, you've got to, you know, try extra hard to change culture, but it's now a little challenging to have conversations in that space. Are you confident or happy that we're going to navigate through that, or do we just have to bash our way through to make sure that decades and decades of bad behavior is just overcome?
Yeah, I think we've done quite a bit here. One, it's all about example, right? To do it, and here
Yeah,
I hired 11 chairs since I've been here, and 6 are women. You know, to
yeah,
do. There are people that are doing it that way. We also do a lot. We've been, you know, the thing with George Floyd and the whole racial issue. You know, I never used to speak about race because I'm white. You know, I didn't think I
yeah,
had much to
yeah,
say. And we've actually started some bystander training courses here. So if someone says something really stupid, which frequently is in the operating room, I mean, people think it is a sanctuary, and you can say or do anything and say, I'm trying to save my patient, where
yeah,
it's not. And that's why, you know, things that they say to nurses or things they say to students, and even things that nurses say to students are terrible. So teaching people to call it out in a way that's comfortable to saying, I'm sure you didn't mean to say something that rude, and would you repeat what you just said? And of course, nobody ever does. But I think learning how to be frustrated and stressed at the same time, not bashing the person next to you, you know, to do
yeah,
it. And then I must admit, even though I came from downstate Illinois, which was, you know, my high school was all white except for
sure,
Black kids that were in the deaf ed class. I mean, that's all we saw. But when I went back to get a high school award, you know, it's very different. You know,
yeah,
there's all
yeah,
sorts of underrepresented. There's many Hispanics. There's many Eastern European and Russian. I mean, the new kids are coming up with all sorts of diversity to do, unless you're poor. And then I think you have a situation that's much more complicated to do it. But I think we're getting there. I think part of it, what I worry about so much, I mean, every day there's something crazy, you know, this on TV and how people speak out. And you just listen to this and you just go, I can't believe people can behave and act like that. So the social media and the leaders that we've seen have just been absolutely, no matter where your politics are, have been absolutely unforgivable about what people
yeah,
say and do. And so I think making sure you set a good example, calling out things that are not good. And then I do think the new generation knows nothing but women leaders,
yeah,
people of color. They're in their classrooms, especially once they get to med school. We have COVID-19. I always say, what has COVID-19 done for you lately? You know, with virtual interviews, we were able to get a much more diverse medical school class because not everybody would travel, but they'll
yeah,
do. I do think virtual interviews are fairer for interviews, even though all of us would prefer to have them in person. You know, those oral exams we used to take in hotel rooms with people yelling at us. I mean, I did my last exam, I did do virtual exams. I mean, the examinees are so much more relaxed because they're not breathing your air. And I was on the board at age 42, so I gave 23 years of boards. And I made a guy cry. I mean, I kept asking him question after question. He didn't know any answer. And then my associate examiner said, he's crying. And I looked at him, I'm really sorry, but you don't know the answers. I mean, it's not my fault. You're stupid, you know. But so, you know, I'm known as pretty tough too, but that was the nature of who we are. But
oh yeah, it was,
I think we're better. I mean, I
yeah,
still have instances where people say and do stupid things, you know, but overall, I think the new generation is so used to the room being diverse that if it's not, they notice.
And a little, I mean, the very first time I sat on the fellowship exams as an examiner in the Royal College on the other side of the Atlantic, I was paired with a senior examiner, of course, for guidance and wisdom. And I vividly remember we examined this young man who was wearing a blazer and slacks and, very nicely turned out, and he seemed quite appropriate, and his questions were all correct and all that sort of stuff. And at the end of when the bell rang, I turned to my colleague, and he said, well, we'll fail him. And I said, sorry. And he said, no suit, thin end of the wedge.
The guy once too, the guy, we were interviewing a kid with a pink shirt on, and Ken Ramming said, we can't hire him. Yeah, really?
Exactly. So,
and I was asked too. I was asked, "Are you getting married? And how many kids you're going to have?" Yeah. And they were just like, "Well, my answer was, I have no idea," which was the answer. And actually, my favorite one was when you had to go do the interview for the American College of Surgeons. I think they still do it in person. So I show up, and there's a couple guys from UCLA there. And the guy running the interview is Asian. I'm pretty sure he was from Cambodia. And so he's asking me questions about and the last question, he looks at me and he goes, I asked you one personal question, and I probably should have said no. He goes, how do you get your housework done? And of course, my guys just looked at me, and I said, I'm very organized. So I did end up writing a letter to the college. So as I walked out, the next person coming in was a pregnant woman. And I said, you're going to have to explain that how that happened. And I wrote back saying, I'm sure they didn't ask. And the guy was just curious. I think he just wanted to.
Yeah, sure.
He was curious, but totally inappropriate.
Yeah, he would just never have assumed that anyone else would do the housework, I mean, it was just a thoughtless thing. So what happens? I mean, I know this is a silly question because clearly you do not switch the light off and you do not go home because of all the work you're doing. But what about outside of work? What gives you fun and relaxation?
Yeah. Well, that's why my husband's so great. So I have an endless pool. So I swim in a pool with a current. I've had one.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
I had one in my house in Milwaukee. Him and my husband and I walk all the time. We have a new little dog, so that's fun. I read a lot. I read fiction. I read novels. I read self-help. COVID made me not read so much, but I'm always reading. I bet I read 8 books a month. Just love to read fiction. I'm also a crafter, so I make things. So I sew, I craft. My brother's a real good painter, and I'm not a real good painter, but I craft things, make things. I make things for the people that work with me. I have 4 grandkids with my stepkids, so I make them stuff as well too. So I'm always sewing, making things. My mother did that, so I think that was genetic. And we love to travel. Luckily, we're going to get to travel a little bit more, but we love to travel. We don't like going the same place over and over. We've had a couple houses down in Hilton Head and stuff. And after COVID, we decided we couldn't retire there. So we like going somewhere different all the time. We're headed to Portugal for a meeting and staying a few days. And I'm finally getting to the Galapagos. I was supposed to go in 2020. So you know what happened to that. But
yeah.
So we're going this summer. And then I have a son who likes traveling with us and his wife, which we're not quite sure why they do, but they do. And so he's going to be 28. So we're going with them this summer. So taking those trips have been nice. And we just took the channel last summer down to Paris from London. And I'd never been to Paris. I had been once years ago. So traveling is nice to come back now that I really feel like COVID isn't going to attack me every minute I walk out. So
no. Yeah, well, if your son is anything like my kids, I'm sure it's the the financial support he gets traveling with you that is quite a significant factor. So you use the word there, retirement. You don't look like somebody who's got a clock on the wall down to retirement. So what does that look like for you? And what's the thinking? As in, I've interviewed a number of people who clearly have no intention of retiring ever. I interviewed a good friend of mine, a guy called Robbie Madoff, who was a colorectal surgeon in Minneapolis for many years, similar age to us. And he literally just walked out and moved back to Brooklyn to be with his kids,
Yeah, well, my husband's 5 years older than me. And he's asked sort of, because he's 73 and he lost his brother a couple of years ago to cancer, and one of his best friends died this year of amyloidosis, and that was really hard. And so he sort of looked at me and said, "When are we done?" He knows I need something to do.
Yeah.
And we love living here. So we are probably in a year or two. We're going to move by my son in Potomac. We bought a house up there. And I'm actually just got asked to be chair-elect of the board of AAMC, which I wasn't planning on doing. I was planning on quitting. And I'm also still very busy with Aga Khan. I'm on the board of trustees and run their health science thing. So I think I'll work with the AAMC. I also am a really good coach and mentor. Carlos Pellegrini is doing that a little bit, and I do that anyway to make it happen when we connected. I do still operate. I do thoracic outlet surgery, and I operate probably 2 or 3 times a month, and I'm real good at it. But now I think 2 or 3 of my partners here and many across the country, so they don't need me to do this surgery. I like taking care of patients, so that's good. That'll probably be the hardest. I've really cut down my surgical piece, but I still enjoy patient care, to do it. So, but I think, I'm 68, and my son will probably have a kid in the next year or two. And my other grandkids are on the West Coast. We don't see them as often. And I think the other thing is, you need to, now that COVID has interrupted all our lives, the travel we want to do, we need to get done soon, because my husband's 73. So I do think in the next 5 years to make that happen, and hopefully you'll get your health. I certainly don't want to get sick here at work. I have 3 of my chairs who have gotten cancer since I've been here, and one looks like it's unremitting. One had to have a bone marrow transplant. One had peritoneal mesothelioma. I've looked at the 3 of them and watching what they're doing, and one's a surgeon, to do it. And I, tomorrow you and I could wake up and something could be wrong.
For sure. Yeah.
So I think I'm really ready. I think also I've trained up so many amazing people that I actually think that they can go do this. And this new dean I hired, she's got different ideas than me. And I found myself sort of wanting to tell her she's crazy, but then I'm out of my. Nobody told me that, so shut up, Julie. Let her. She's right. She's a woman of color. She's an internist. She's really smart, and I need to let her make her own mistakes and do it
for sure.
And get out of her way.
And there's one thing. I was taught years ago when I was working in Imperial. And it certainly applies to people like you and me with slightly odd names that, 6 months after you leave, they won't remember how you spelt your name.
Absolutely. And you also want to leave where they can say you did great things, and if asked, they would like you to come back. And they don't have the party after you leave, they have to go, and I've moved so many places, I've left many places, and they all remember me. But they've moved on and done just fine to do it. And I think part of it is, I think the biggest thing right now is seeing some of our friends die and get sick. And You know, we had a few in your 40s and 50s that were unlucky, and then you had about 20 years that everybody was okay, and now we're going to see that, and so I think part of that has made it real that
sure.
we want to
So,
make that.
So how would you like to be remembered, and how do you think you will be remembered?
I always want to be remembered as a really good surgeon, not only technically, but there for my patients, and good teacher, you know, to do it. And then my greatest joy is bringing on the next generation. If I were to tell you why, my mother did that as a teacher. And I have so many of my trainees now. You know, in Hopkins, I started in 2003. So here we are 20 years later, and you see them all out there being chairs. They're excellent surgeons. They're rising to leadership in our societies. And there's nothing better than watching them accomplish things I never could. And that you knew them when, you know, you gave them the inspiration and the aspiration, you know, to really aspire to go do that. And the innovation piece is just amazing. So that's what I want to be known for. Not only surgeons, but even my team who are non-surgeons, that I allowed us to do things better as a team, made things better than when we showed up, and have fun along the way.
Any regrets?
I wish I had had kids a little earlier. I wish I had had a daughter, but I never did. But no, the things that happen bad, it puts you into the place you're supposed to be.
Sure.
I was divorced. I moved around. You know, I didn't do everything. I think that's also being a surgeon, right? Sometimes you have a complication, you know, and you just have to do your best to get on the other side.
Life is a complication, you know.
Right.
It's very much.
I'll do on that one.
Exactly. So on that profound note, Julie, I just want to thank you again for being for taking such a long time with me today, and it's been a fascinating story, and it'll come out in a few weeks, and no doubt it'll make you even more famous than you are already. I doubt it very much, but